Awesome, Adam. Now we are, as we've taken our journey left to right here, we've now at the nav engine. And in this particular drawing, it's just one big box. But what goes on inside here is quite complicated. And this is a location where a lot of our own secret sauce is actually added
Yeah.
to deal with the complexities, especially of different types of platforms, from a drone to a human, that all act and behave differently in the real world. So if I go down to the blowout here, and the red here is going to show you where the places are where we've got some special sauce. Why don't you start here, and let's just do what we did above and go left to right, and start with this first time alignment box, which I think is making sure that all this pre-processing we did with these sensors, we bring them back in some measure of alignment for all the calculations actually to begin.
Yeah, that's right. The big challenge that you have in a real-time system is every sensor is different. It may take longer for the data to actually be generated by the sensor. It might come out quickly, but then take a long time to actually get transmitted from the sensor to the computer. And so ultimately you have the data coming in somewhat of a random order, but you can't really operate a system if your data is random. So the key with the time alignment is because previously we talked about the time provider, which is coordinating the sensor time so that we can know that an IMU measurement captured at some moment corresponds with GNSS data from some other time. We can now basically put it back in order. This is a little easier said than done, but ultimately you push these measurements into this time alignment stage in this random order, and the time alignment puts them back into the order that they actually apply in the real world so that the rest of the system can use them without having to go through a lot of extra steps. That isn't to say in some cases that it's impossible to take advantage of data that's out of order. It's just a lot more complicated, and it has a lot more limitations in some cases.
Yeah, and it's interesting on this for a layman like me. A lot of what I've read about is how a lot of these positioning engines actually fail due to poor time alignment.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the algorithms themselves, but if you don't get this properly aligned, you're going to be in a mess of trouble.
Yeah, for sure. At the simplest, most naive case, if you've got data out of order, you could just drop the measurements and say, all right, well, sorry, you came late to the party, you're not usable. But that'll really impact your performance, obviously. So that's a really, really critical step, is to get the data in the correct order to within some sort of limits of the real-time system so that you can process it without having to go through a whole bunch of additional hoops. Once the data is in, the next sort of step is, what's classically called measurement modeling. And the idea here is, given where I think I might be, right, the system has been operating and we've calculated a position and maybe a velocity and everything else, what do I think that the measurements from some sensor should look like, right? So take GNSS, for example. At a given place on the Earth, you're going to see measurements from specific satellites, and the measurements will be specific ranges to those satellites. And so if I think I am somewhere over there, I expect to see measurements that are consistent with being over there.
I see.
And so you take the actual measurements that you got in that just came in through your time alignment, and you compare them to what you think they should be. And the difference tells you something about how wrong you are about where you really are in the world. Now, that's not an immediate answer, right? You can't take one measurement and know, I thought I was there, but I'm really right here very precisely, because in practice, the measurements you're actually bringing in are going to have tons of noise, tons of other sources of error. And so an important part of this modeling is not just doing this comparison, but also trying to model and eliminate as much of that error as you possibly can to get down to this really precise answer.
So interesting. So when you say eliminate, are you doing things like, if you see consistent wrong input, are you discarding it? Or what do you actually, what
Right.
actually gets taken?
Yeah, you very well might. Say I think that I am on First Avenue, and I'm very confident about that. And I get measurements that tell me, actually, you're on 10th Avenue. Well, wait a second now. That's pretty far away, right? So one of us is probably wrong. Now, if I'm really confident about where I am, then it's entirely possible those measurements are just wrong. If I have lots of measurements and they're all consistent with being on 10th Avenue, then maybe that's a sign that I'm mistaken. But at first glance, I might want to throw some measurements away. Now, in the real world, what actually can happen, and happens very often, is you have a lot of measurements, and some of them are good, and some of them are very bad, and some of them are subtly not so great. And so a real difficult challenge becomes, well, how do I find the good and eliminate the bad so that it doesn't ultimately impact my system? If I take a measurement that says I'm on 10th Avenue, that might really pull the position very far away. Now, I've had other measurements too. So it doesn't mean I'm going to jump over to 10th Avenue, but I might slide over to 2nd. And if I reject that measurement, but maybe in my mix are a couple of measurements that are consistent with being on 2nd or 3rd, well, maybe now my position drifts to the other side of 1st, right? And so there is this balance where sometimes it's pretty clear and you can just say, that measurement, not so good, throw it out. But
Gotcha.
more often the case that the measurements are not truly obvious, and it takes a lot more smarts and a lot more effort to either say, they're telling me something about the world, but maybe not everything I need to know. Maybe I don't trust them as much as I trust something else, to try to avoid getting dragged around from one street to another.
Gotcha. And same thing here. You're doing this measurement model. If we can pop up to the top here with this, the preprocessed GNSS that we talked about previously, as well as now the RTK input. It's also coming in at this stage.
Correct. Yeah. And the preprocessed GNSS, we talked about some of what's going on in that preprocessing. A lot of that is related to what we just said. Something like multipath detection. Multipath is where the signal's coming from the satellite. It may come directly to your antenna, but it might also bounce off that tall glass building over there on the other side of the street. And if I get both of those bounces, they kind of blur together, and then it becomes less obvious what the right answer is. Or in the extreme case, the signal that is going direct from the satellite might be blocked by a tall building, and the only thing I see is a bounce that's actually incorrect. And so one of the steps in pre-processing is trying to detect those scenarios so that we can, ahead of time, we can reject those measurements. Because if you don't, you may be in the situation where it's the obvious 10th Avenue measurement, but you might also be in the situation, maybe more likely, where it's the 2nd Avenue measurement. And so if you can detect that with other means ahead of time, then when you get to measurement modeling, you go, oh, you know what? That measurement, I know it's that good. I'm not even going to try to use it.
Right.
So that's coming in here. And then we have this RTK input, which is really critical to getting down to the super fine, precise position level. What this is doing is effectively providing a source of sort of comparison so that we can remove most, or in some cases all, of the sources of error that affect GNSS. GNSS, for many, many reasons, is affected by a lot of different kinds of error. And they have different characteristics, and some are big, some are small. But what you get is a handful of measurements that are all wrong by some amount. And so this RTK input basically, roughly provides you a picture of those same measurements from somewhere else. That's a good way to think about it. And so if you imagine somebody else down the street looking at those same satellites and seeing almost the exact same picture that you're seeing, they're also seeing a lot of the same sources of error. And so we can take their measurements, combine them with our measurements, and say, all right, if we're both seeing the same thing, we can maybe cancel that out. That's a very high level, hand wavy way of describing it, but that's kind of what's going on. And so we take this input and we're using that to eliminate, or at least to mitigate, some of the much, much bigger sources of error on the GNSS. And what you're left with, you still have things that you couldn't truly eliminate, but you're left with a lot of that error being gone. And now you're down to a much, much more accurate answer.
Yeah, that will be a wonderful topic for another day, is how RTK actually works. It is rather complicated. I've been digging deep into that myself here over the last few days, and I'm still struggling to understand it. And hopefully, you will unpack that later.
I would be happy to. We can talk for 10 minutes or 10 hours if you'd like. There's lots of material in there. But suffice it to say, we have this input coming in. We talk about it as different than the sensor input. In practice, it actually is another kind of sensor.
Yeah.
But we sort of think about it as a different category. It's not the sensors on my vehicle. It's the sensors somewhere else in the world that are helping me out. But it all feeds into this measurement modeling, which is that process of saying, hey, here's what I think the measurements should have looked like if I'm right. And here's what you told me. How does that compare? We take that information, that sort of comparison, those are sort of, in our speak, we call those innovations. And we feed that into this estimator. Now, the estimator's job, and there's many kinds of estimators, but for the most part, any kind of estimator, its job is to find a way to combine these many measurements, many innovations, and weight them and tease out the ones that maybe aren't so good versus the ones that are, and compare them with my current picture of the world and do an update to that picture. And so we think our position is this, we think our velocity is that, we think our orientation is this other thing. And we say, hey, if that was true, here's how the measurements relate to those things. Because what I measured might not be position or velocity. What I measured may be range to a satellite or the speed of the left rear wheel. And so you have to find a way to relate those pieces of information, those measurements, into the things of actual interest, position, velocity. Then you take these innovations that are telling you how those measurements differ from what we think they should have been, and that relates through this math to, well, how wrong was my position? How wrong was my velocity? And we do it in such a way that we're kind of considering, okay, how noisy, how much error do I think the measurements may have versus how confident am I about what I think is true for position and velocity? For example, if I am extremely confident in the position, I'm really sure of where we are, and you give me measurements that are pretty different, I'm going to be a little bit skeptical. If you flip that around and you say, well, we just started up and I really don't know where I am, and I take in some measurements, the measurements may not be super accurate, or they may be, depends if I have RTK corrections, for example, or not. But either way, these measurements tell me something about the world. And so I feed them into the estimator, and the estimator says, okay, I think the position is maybe a little more in that direction. And we move a little bit in that direction. Get more measurements, learn more about the world, continue updating. So that's the estimator's job, is to learn about the world over time and become more confident the more information it gathers.
Gotcha. And I think one of the things you were touching, and not to jump ahead, was there are times when you're sitting inside of each of these modules. When you're extremely confident of where we are and you get a sensor reading, especially think about an IMU, that is wrong and you know it's wrong, then you can actually feed that information back into the system to make your adjustments when you're relying on that sensor in the future.
That's exactly right. So that is one of the keys to ultimately producing an extremely precise navigation solution. Anybody can take measurements and compute a position, but it's the way in which you correct those incorrect measurements, which is going to dictate how good is that position in the more difficult environments. I can take a GPS receiver and go out in a parking lot and just stand there and get a great position. It's going to look really nice all day long, no matter what I do. I don't even need this estimator doing all this crazy business.
Right.
But take that same GPS receiver and go drive under a grove of trees that is the entrance to a tunnel, drive through that tunnel for 10 kilometers and come out the other side. Good luck telling me where you are.
Yeah.
So that is exactly right. Every one of these sensors has all kinds of sources of error. Let's take a very obvious example is wheels, right? We can take input from wheel speeds, and there's different ways that's presented in different types of vehicles. But ultimately, your wheel spins a certain rate, and that tells you how far you drove. Well, what if your tires are underinflated? So now, instead of your tire being a specific diameter, it's actually slightly less. If the tire spins the same amount, because that's what you're measuring, you didn't go as far. So that would be a source of error. Or if your tires are overinflated, maybe you're one of those people who thinks that you're supposed to fill to the maximum PSI that's written on the side of the tire. I'm glad your tires didn't explode, but that would be a pretty gross error. So the system has to be capable of detecting these kinds of things. And the way it does that is the more measurements you take in, the more it learns about the world. And so it's comparing both explicitly and implicitly through the estimator, all the different types of sensors, all the different types of error. And it can use that to build this knowledge about how correct or incorrect a given sensor is. If we take the IMU, because this is sort of a lesser understood source of error, people think the IMU measures gravity, and that's great. Gravity goes down. But that's not really true. For one thing, the IMU isn't really only measuring gravity, but it's certainly affected by acceleration and rotation. That's most of the point. In fact, we almost don't want gravity to some degree. Um, but the IMU is telling you about accelerations. You know, if we remember back to our high school physics, right? Gravity is an acceleration that's pulling you down towards the Earth. But lots of things pull you in other directions. And if you imagine, say we expect that gravity is, back to our high school, right? 9.8 meters per second squared. That's 1g. That's our typical acceleration sitting on the surface of the Earth. Well, what if my sensor, what if I was not moving? I'm just sitting there, not moving, put the car in park. I expect to see 9.8. What if the sensor reads 10 or 11? Or what if it reads 8, right? If I do nothing, then what I think is that I'm actually accelerating up or down.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But if
All right.
I don't do anything at all, I'm going to have a bad time because now I think my car is going to outer space. So that's another one of these sensor corrections that we have to account for. The IMU might be wrong. It might not just measure acceleration in these directions, but it might measure acceleration that's not so great. And there's various flavors of error. There's various reasons for that error. Um, for one thing, the IMU may be better or worse in hotter or colder weather. So what if it's really cold outside? What if you get in the car and you crank the heat and now 5 minutes later, it's really hot in the car? The IMU error will change over that period of time. So there's a lot of stuff that we have to account for, and that all gets fed back into this measurement modeling process so that we're ultimately getting the absolute best answer we can. When we say, what should the measurements be? We can include how much error do I think this sensor has to get a much more precise picture.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's incredible. And all this is happening at 10 or 50 or 100 times a second too.
Oh yeah.
Which still blows my mind. Well, let's jump to another deeply important and complex element here, which is in this little red box called dynamics modeling, is where we're understanding the actual motion models of the platform itself. I think is what we're looking at here, from a drone that moves like this, or a motorcycle moves like this, or a human is twisting and turning, and interpreting the sensor movement and understanding that. Can you explain that on why it's different and how a system like ours can actually account for it?
Yeah, sure. Exactly the way you said it. That's how it is, right? Every type of vehicle or type of thing that's carrying a device, because it might be a person or an animal for that matter, is going to behave very differently. We take sort of the simplest case in some respects is a car. Cars are, for one thing, pretty well known. We're all pretty familiar with how they operate, and they have a lot of constraints that are kind of really useful. Unless you're in big trouble, your car is not going to go sideways, for example. It's also probably not going to go up or down. It usually tends to stay on the road. So we can take advantage of some of these features of different types of vehicles to help us learn about the world, just like we take advantage of everything else. If let's go back to our IMU, for example. If our IMU tells me that I'm accelerating rapidly upward and I'm in a car, I know that's probably not true. Now, is my acceleration truly zero in the up direction? No, I may have gone over a bump, but I'm probably not floating off to space. If I am, then all of this doesn't matter. So the dynamics modeling is really important. When you have an IMU, um, some of that becomes more straightforward about how you approach it. The IMU is telling you how the vehicle is accelerating in every direction and how it's rotating in every direction. And so if I integrate that, I can get a picture of how what we call the state, what the estimator is estimating, position, velocity, and so on, is evolving over time. And that's what dynamics modeling is all about, right? How do I evolve these things in the absence of other information? And so the IMU provides that information for us to say, hey, we have accelerated, which means our velocity is changing, and our velocity tells us how our position is changing, and so on. But we may not have an IMU. In some platforms, some products, all you've got is GNSS. And so in that case, you can't rely on the IMU to just tell you that answer. And you may need to rely on something else about how you know this type of environment evolves, how this type of vehicle works in the world. And so if we go back to sort of this car example, again, we can make assumptions all day long about how cars don't go sideways. But now let's take an aircraft. They absolutely do go sideways, right? Even when an airplane is flying along straight and level, most of the time there's going to be some wind up there pushing it in different directions, and it's going to be going a little bit sideways. And certainly airplanes go up and down, cars don't. So we can take advantage of that when we have the opportunity. And in other cases, we have to at least consider it as part of the modeling process to say, okay, this is going to affect us in these ways. This is going to be a limitation. Maybe we have to allow for a little more wiggle room or a little more uncertainty in, say, the acceleration, because an airplane might get hit by a gust of wind. And so it may rapidly accelerate and then go back to normal, but it might happen on occasion. Or if we take a motorcycle, when motorcycles going fast and they're turning, they have a tendency to bank over a little bit, right? The motorcycle that whoever's driving it is going to roll with the turn. That's a little bit natural, and at really high speeds, it's something that you kind of have to study and do well and be careful about, but it's something that's definitely going to happen. Meanwhile, on a car, not really going to happen.
Yeah.
Maybe you're on a test track, maybe something like that, but for the most part, the car is not leaning way over. So there's a lot that goes into this dynamics modeling that makes the estimator's ability to predict where we are better or worse. And that prediction ultimately feeds back into the measurement model, right? That is really the key. You got a new measurement for some new time. You had an estimate of where you were previously. If we want to model the new measurements to do the comparison and compute those innovations, well, I don't need to know where I was earlier. I need to know where I am now. And so that's what this process is all about, is basically moving ourselves forward in time, given what we know internally, so that we can then apply the measurement.
Gotcha. So now let's drop down to this RTK fixing and connect the dots for me a little bit, where it sounded as if we were doing some initial RTK-like stuff in the measurement modeling. And what is the difference here when we're doing the RTK fixing?
Yeah, it's a bit of a deep topic, and we could go into it for hours, but the short version is the satellites are sending measurements, or at least you're making measurements of the data they're sending. And one of those measurements is called carrier phase. Carrier phase is a really precise measurement. And you can use that to get a very, very good bead on how far away you are from the satellite. Now, the way GNSS works at a very high level is you measure the range to a bunch of satellites and you triangulate to figure out where you are. You know where the satellites are. They actually tell you that. And if you compare the range from that satellite over there and from this satellite over here, you ultimately can produce a picture of where you are. If those ranges have quite a bit of error in them, then the answer from where am I is going to have quite a bit of error. So the RTK, back on the measurement modeling side, we take these measurements like we talked about before from this other receiver that's somewhere else, seeing a similar picture of the sky, and we can use that to counteract a lot of the sources of error. So now we can get measurements that are much more precise. But the two types of range measurements you can get off of the signal, they're called pseudo-range and carrier phase. The pseudo-range measurements are absolute. When I get a measurement, I know that it is 26 million meters away, or whatever the distance is for that particular satellite. Very precisely, but the actual ability to measure the pseudo-range is limited. So the noise on those measurements may still be on the order of, I'll call it a meter, after you've removed all the other sources of error from the RTK. So if you're really aiming for a 1 centimeter accurate position, that's not going to cut it.
Right.
Now we have these other measurements.
Just for some clarity too, and we may be getting too deep into here, which we will say for another time too. The pseudo range, as I understand it, is measuring the distance from the satellite to the device.
Correct.
That's correct? And the carrier phase is where along that signal is on some wave that repeats every, I don't know, 19 inches, 19 centimeters.
It's
some
yeah,
range.
19 centimeters is closer, and so it's a really small window. And so the carrier phase, both of them are giving you the range to the satellite. The problem is the carrier phase, as you said, it repeats. And so if you told me there were, whatever, 1 million or 10 million or 100 million repeats of that between me and the satellite, okay, now I can tell you, I multiply by 19 centimeters, I can tell you exactly how far away it is.
Yeah.
But I have no idea what that number is. I can't know. And so that's where RTK fixing comes in. Everything up till this point has allowed me to use absolute measurements, but now I've got these carrier phases that the noise on the pseudo range, let's say it's 1 meter, the noise on the carrier phase might be a fraction of a centimeter. And so I really want to use those. But my problem is I have this ambiguity, we call it, right? I don't know how many repeats there were. And so the RTK fixing's job is to figure that answer out. Once I know that answer, if you tell me there were exactly 10 million repeats between the satellite when the signal got transmitted and when it hit my antenna, well, 10 million times 19 centimeters tells me exactly what that range was. There's no ambiguity anymore. There's no question. And if I can do that correctly for enough satellites, enough carrier phase measurements, well, now I know exactly where I am because I can triangulate, and the amount of error in that triangulation is almost nothing. So that's the idea with RTK fixing. Now, it's certainly way easier said than done, because if we just talk about that one measurement, right, we've got millions of possible answers. Now you scale that up for all the satellites in the sky, and the search space becomes impossible.
And I think that's where I'm going to sound maybe smart for a minute, where the pseudo range comes in, because the pseudo range, even though if you're a meter off, it's still giving you, hey, we're within, say, 1 million or 1,000,010 cycles.
Right.
So instead of solving for the entirety of what it could be, you're in a much closer window.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So the pseudo range and other information from the world, it's not just GNSS. It might be computer vision, right? But I might have lots of sources of information. The estimator's combining them all, and we're using that information to as an input to this RTK fixing process, which says, yeah, I know there's this huge search space, but there's a very small range of values that are most likely correct. And for this other measurement, there's a different small range of values. And so if I can narrow down that search space, it certainly now becomes a tractable problem. It doesn't become an easy problem, but you can now imagine a scenario where you do come up with the right numbers. And once you know those numbers, you hold your fix, so to speak, and those numbers aren't going to change. Because what will happen if I move away or the satellite moves away, that both things can happen, satellites are always moving, that unknown number of cycles won't change. What will change is the thing I am tracking, which is the additional number of cycles. And that is something I'm actively measuring very precisely. So once I know that number, I know it. And I can
So,
lock it in and I don't have to figure it out again.
but playing that back in Tom speak again, and this was a breakthrough for me when I was doing research on this. Imagine, I'm going to grossly simplify, but hold me honest. As I understand it in my speak is, and this was a breakthrough for me, and kind of my own understanding was greatly simplified. Imagine that we get that initial fix, and at that point we have extreme confidence in the number of carrier phases essentially between the satellite and the device.
Right.
Plus, you know where you are on the carrier phase of that last remaining bit. And once I've locked that in, now the device is counting how many carrier waves because it knows.
That's right.
From that known point, it does not matter. It's no longer doing this refixing, if you will, which does happen when it goes out of fix for a variety of reasons.
That's exactly.
So now it has certainty and can continue that certainty because it's measuring the carrier phases from there.
That's right. Yeah. The trick with the carrier phases is there's sort of two parts to it. When you start tracking the signal, from then on, the receiver it's what they call accumulated range, right? It is accumulating the change in carrier phase very precisely. The problem is it doesn't know what that starting number was. So once we figure out that starting number, I know very precisely the range to that satellite forever until something happens. Maybe the signal goes behind a building or I drive into a tunnel. But until that happens, I know exactly where that satellite is. Now, if I can get that level of confidence in enough satellites, I can tell you exactly where we are.